ever dreamt of jetting off on vacation, without that guilty feeling? I know I have.
Yeah.
And that's what makes this deep dive into your research on hydrogen planes so fascinating.
Right.
We're cracking open this 2024 paper from GKN Aerospace and see if these eco-friendly flyers are ready for takeoff or maybe facing some turbulence.
Yeah. And it's not just like some far-off fantasy anymore, right? GKN's gone way beyond just, talking about it.
Yeah.
They've actually modeled these hydrogen fuel cell systems on different sizes of planes, from a small 48-seater all the way up to a pretty roomy 160-seater, which is impressive.
Okay, now I'm really intrigued. So hydrogen planes, that's not exactly a brand new idea, right? What makes this research stand out from what we've heard before?
You're right. Hydrogen's been getting a lot of buzz. It's kind of the hot topic. What's really different here is that GKN is laser focused on fuel cells.
Yeah.
They're not talking about burning the hydrogen directly.
Okay.
This is really the key to achieving truly zero emission flying.
Wow.
The only thing coming out of these planes is water vapor.
Now that's what I call clean flying.
Yeah.
But one thing that always comes to mind with hydrogen is the storage, right? It's not like you can just pump that into a regular, airplane fuel tank. How did GKN approach this challenge?
You hit the nail on the head. Storing hydrogen is a bit of a tricky business. It has to be incredibly cold. We're talking cryogenic level cold, or it's got to be kept under immense pressure. And for those larger planes they've modeled, GKN decided to go with cryogenic liquid storage. So picture like a superpowered thermos flask, keeping that hydrogen chilled to a mind-boggling minus 253 degrees Celsius.
Wow, that is seriously cold. But keeping anything that cold has got to require energy, right? How does that impact the plane's overall efficiency?
That's where GKN's research takes a really fascinating turn. They've actually figured out a way to use that extreme cold to their advantage, and not just for storing the fuel, but to actually make the whole electrical system more efficient.
Hold on, the cold makes things more efficient. That sounds a bit like something out of a science fiction movie.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But at those unbelievably low temperatures, certain materials basically transform into what are called superconductors. And what that means is they can conduct electricity with practically zero resistance. It's like turning the plane's entire electrical system into this, superhighway for energy. Power just flows through it with almost no loss.
So less wasted energy equals a more efficient plane overall.
You got it.
Yeah.
And GKN's research suggests that by using these super cold temperatures for the plane's electrical wiring, they could potentially increase its powertrain efficiency by a pretty significant amount, something like 10%. And here's an added bonus. It also makes the entire system lighter, which is a huge win in the world of aviation. Every ounce counts.
Yeah. That's really impressive. Okay, so they've cracked the code on storage and even figured out a way to use it to their advantage in terms of efficiency. But can these hydrogen planes actually fly any decent distance? What kind of range are we talking about here?
Well, that's where GKN's notional platforms come into play. They've taken these concepts and modeled them on different aircraft sizes, to really see how they'd perform in a real-world scenario.
Okay, so let's start small. Tell me about this 48-seater. Is that even practical for hydrogen power?
So they actually looked at two different versions of the 48-seater, one equipped with the classic propellers and another one with ducted fans, which, they look kind of like jet engines but are actually quieter and much more efficient, especially at higher speeds. Now, that propeller version, that's really interesting because it needs less power. It's almost like, the first step, the baby step into this whole world of hydrogen aviation.
Makes sense. And the ducted fan version, that's got to be for those who like it a little bit faster.
Exactly. Yeah. GKN's research indicates that a 48-seater with those ducted fans cruising at a very respectable Mach 0.55 is totally doable.
Mach 0.55, that's pretty impressive for a smaller plane.
Yeah.
What about something bigger? Let's say a 96-seater. Can hydrogen power handle that kind of capacity?
This is where GKN's model really starts to take off, so to speak. They've demonstrated that a 96-seater, equipped with 4 of those ducted fans, could realistically achieve a range of over 1,600 nautical miles. To put that into perspective, that's even longer than a flight from New York City to Denver.
Okay, color me impressed. And this is all based on technology that could be ready by, 2035? That's not that far off.
You got it. That's what they're projecting, and they're calling it TRL-6 technology, meaning it's well on its way from the lab to the runway.
Wow. So we've got a 48-seater, a 96-seater. Are they thinking even bigger than that?
Oh, absolutely. They've even got a 160-seater concept on the drawing board.
Now that's thinking big. But hold on a second. This all sounds pretty amazing, but I'm sure there are some Some serious hurdles to overcome before we're all sipping on tomato juice at 30,000 feet in a hydrogen-powered plane. What are some of the challenges they identified?
You're absolutely right. There are always going to be challenges when you're dealing with a technology this groundbreaking. One thing that GKN really emphasizes is the absolute need for what they call a clean sheet design approach.
Clean sheet. Does that mean they're planning on serving gourmet meals on these flights? Because I'm all for that.
I wish. No, clean sheet means designing these planes from the ground up, specifically with hydrogen fuel cells in mind. Trying to retrofit existing planes to run on hydrogen, well, it's like trying to fit, as they say, a square peg in a round hole. It's just not ideal.
Makes sense. Starting from scratch would give them a lot more flexibility to optimize the design for this new type of fuel and the power system that goes with it.
Precisely. What they've learned through their modeling is that even small changes, like where those fuel tanks are positioned, can have a huge impact on the plane's balance and its overall flight characteristics.
So it's about way more than just swapping out the engines. It's about rethinking the entire plane. Now, you mentioned that they're favoring a centralized hydrogen system. Why is that?
They're really prioritizing safety and scalability with this approach. With a centralized system, all of the hydrogen is stored in one dedicated, sealed-off zone, usually in the back of the plane. Think of it like, a high-tech, super secure vault for all that hydrogen.
That definitely sounds safer than having hydrogen, piped all over the plane.
Yeah.
What about scalability? Why is that so important?
Well, let's say you want to increase the plane's range or maybe carry more passengers. With this centralized approach, you can just add more fuel tanks or even more fuel cells in that designated area without needing a major redesign. It's a much more, let's say, modular and adaptable design philosophy.
So they've thought about safety, they've thought about scalability. What other design considerations did they highlight?
One really interesting point they bring up is the potential impact on the layout of the aircraft itself. Remember that 160-seater we talked about? Well, they actually envision it with a twin-aisle layout, even for shorter flights.
Wait, a twin aisle for a short flight? That's unheard of. Usually those are reserved for, those long-haul international flights.
Yeah. Exactly. And that's what's so fascinating about this. This technology has the potential to disrupt the entire industry. It's not just about, swapping out the engines. It's about reimagining the whole flying experience.
Faster boarding and deplaning. Count me in.
Right.
Yeah. But what about the airports themselves? Would they need a major makeover to handle hydrogen-powered planes?
You're thinking like a true deep dive listener. And the answer is a resounding yes. Airports would definitely need a whole new set of infrastructure to handle this cryogenic liquid hydrogen. We're talking new fueling systems, specialized storage tanks, and a whole new level of safety protocols that go along with it.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, literally. GKN seems to have the technology pretty much figured out, and they're already thinking ahead about the design. But every new technology has its hiccups, its challenges. What are some of the potential downsides or concerns that they raised?
You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
GKN does acknowledge some concerns specifically about those blended wing body designs, or BWBs for short.
Blended wing body. For those of us who aren't, aeronautical engineers, what are we talking about here?
Picture a plane that basically looks like one giant smooth wing.
Okay.
Very futuristic looking.
Yeah.
But GKN points out that these designs might not be as maneuverable, particularly in those critical emergency situations, which is obviously a major concern.
So more research needed before we see those sleek BWBs in action.
Exactly. Safety has to be the top priority, especially when you're talking about introducing a completely new type of aircraft.
So it sounds like we're potentially on the brink of a real revolution in aviation, but there are still, some pretty big questions up in the air, right?
That's always the case when you're pushing the boundaries of technology. There are always unknowns, but that's part of what makes it so exciting.
Speaking of unknowns, let's talk about, kind of the elephant in the room, or maybe the lack of elephants in the air, I guess, because right now there aren't any hydrogen-powered commercial flights. When can we realistically expect to see these planes, actually in the sky, carrying passengers?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And GKN's research really highlights that it's about way more than just the planes themselves. The entire aviation ecosystem has to be ready and able to support this kind of fundamental change.
Ecosystem. Now you're speaking my language. Give me the details.
Well, think about it. Airports, for example.
Mm-hmm.
They need to make massive investments in a whole new infrastructure for fueling, for storage, for safety. we need to drastically increase the production of green hydrogen, making sure that we have a sustainable supply chain because, let's face it, what's the point of clean flying if the fuel itself isn't clean, right? And then, of course, we need to train pilots, maintenance crews, everyone who's going to be working with this new technology to do it safely and effectively.
So it's not as simple as just, rolling out a shiny new fleet of planes. It's a massive undertaking.
Exactly. GKN's research is a critical piece of the puzzle, for sure, but it's just one piece. But the good news is that momentum seems to be building. Governments around the world, industry leaders, they're investing, quite heavily in hydrogen technology for aviation.
So a lot of work to do, but it sounds like there's, a real sense of optimism, a sense of possibility.
Definitely. There's a shared understanding that we need to find sustainable solutions for aviation. And right now, hydrogen fuel cells are emerging as a very, very strong contender.
Now let's take a closer look at the technology itself for a moment. You mentioned earlier that GKN's centralized system, it actually uses those super cold temperatures not only for fuel storage but also for power distribution, which sounds kind of mind-blowing.
It is.
Can you break down exactly how that works?
Absolutely. Remember those superconductors we were talking about earlier?
Yeah.
The materials that can conduct electricity with almost zero resistance, but only at those crazy low temperatures.
Like they become these, like you said, super efficient energy highways.
Exactly. What GKN is proposing is to actually use these superconducting materials for the electrical wiring that distributes power from the fuel cells to the plane's motors.
So instead of those, those big, thick, heavy copper cables you see in traditional aircraft, they would be using these super efficient superconducting cables.
Precisely. And here's why that's such a big deal. Those traditional copper cables, even the ones they use now, with high voltage, they still lose a significant amount of energy as heat because of something called electrical resistance, especially over long distances.
So by using these superconductors, they can significantly reduce those energy losses, making the whole electrical system much more efficient.
Exactly. Plus, these superconducting cables, they can handle much higher currents than those traditional cables, even if they're the same size, which means they can be lighter and more compact. And as you can imagine, in the world of aviation, weight is everything. Every gram, every ounce counts.
That makes perfect sense. Lighter cables, less energy loss, it all adds up to a more efficient aircraft in the end.
Precisely. And when you think about the fact that a significant chunk of a plane's total weight is actually taken up by its fuel, even small improvements in efficiency can have a huge impact on its range, how far it can fly, how much it can carry.
It really is amazing to think that something as seemingly simple as just changing the materials you use for the wiring could potentially revolutionize how we design and build aircraft.
It's the perfect example of how these, what might seem like small innovations, can have this ripple effect throughout an entire industry.
Now let's go back to those different types of aircraft that GKN has been modeling. You mentioned the 48-seater with propellers, the 48-seater with those ducted fans, the 96-seater with 4 ducted fans. Did they look at any other configurations?
They did. They also explored a 96-seater with just 2 but larger ducted fans.
Interesting. Why would they consider a twin-engine option instead of sticking with 4 engines?
It really boils down to cost. Fewer engines generally translates to lower manufacturing costs, lower maintenance costs, which can be a huge deal for airlines.
So it's this kind of trade-off, this balancing act between efficiency and cost.
Exactly.
Did the research show any significant drawbacks to using just 2 engines versus 4?
It's not necessarily about drawbacks, but there are definitely trade-offs to consider. For example, with 2 larger engines, you might see a slight decrease in fuel efficiency compared to 4 smaller engines. However, the cost savings from having 2 engines instead of 4 might actually outweigh that slight dip in efficiency, especially for airlines that are, really watching their bottom line.
It's a balancing act for sure, and I imagine those calculations can get really, really complex.
Absolutely. It's a multifaceted optimization problem, really. You have to take into account the aerodynamics, the propulsion system, the fuel efficiency, manufacturing costs, even things like noise regulations.
So many things to consider. It sounds like GKN really tried to, cover all their bases with their research. Now, you mentioned earlier that they are big proponents of these, what did you call them, clean sheet designs.
Yes.
Why is that so important to them?
Well, they've discovered through their research that trying to adapt existing aircraft designs, the planes we have now, trying to adapt those to use hydrogen power is incredibly difficult. It's Well, it's like trying to fit that proverbial square peg into a round hole. The way that hydrogen needs to be stored, the way it's converted into energy, it all really necessitates a fundamentally different approach to how you design an airplane from the ground up.
So they're essentially saying that we need to, in many ways, completely rethink how we design airplanes.
To a large extent, yes. The shape of the fuel tanks, where you position them, the location of the fuel cells, how the electrical system is laid out, these are all things that need to be factored in from the very beginning of the design process.
It's mind-blowing to think that we might be on the verge of such a fundamental shift in aviation. But what about some of those other really radical designs we've been hearing about, like those sleek, blended wing bodies, those BWBs? Didn't GKN have some reservations about those?
They did. While blended wing body designs have a lot of potential advantages, they could potentially offer better fuel efficiency, lower emissions. GKN has voiced some concerns about their maneuverability, particularly in emergency situations.
So more research is needed before we see those futuristic-looking BWBs, actually gracing the skies.
Yeah, exactly. When you're talking about introducing a brand new type of aircraft, safety has to be the absolute top priority.
Absolutely. Now, we've talked a lot about the technical side of things, but let's zoom out for a moment and talk about the bigger picture. What are some of the potential environmental benefits of making this transition to hydrogen-powered aircraft?
Well, as we touched upon earlier, one of the biggest advantages is that hydrogen fuel cells only produce water vapor as a byproduct. That means zero carbon emissions during flight, which is a huge improvement over traditional jet fuel, which, as we know, is a major contributor to greenhouse gas emissions.
That sounds like a major win for the environment for sure. But what about the carbon footprint of, producing and transporting the hydrogen in the first place? Isn't that a concern as well?
That's a critical point, and it's something the GKN acknowledges in their research. The environmental benefits of hydrogen-powered flight really hinge on our ability to produce what's called green hydrogen. That means hydrogen that's made using renewable energy sources, things like solar power, wind power.
So it's not just about the planes themselves, it's about making sure that the entire hydrogen supply chain is clean and sustainable from start to finish.
Precisely. If we can figure out how to produce and distribute green hydrogen on a large scale, then hydrogen-powered aviation has the potential to dramatically reduce the overall environmental impact of air travel.
It's exciting, but it also sounds like there are still some big ifs involved. What are some of the biggest challenges we face in terms of scaling up green hydrogen production?
One of the biggest hurdles right now is simply cost. Currently, it's more expensive to produce green hydrogen than it is to produce hydrogen from fossil fuels, which is, not what we want.
Right.
But, as with any new technology, the expectation is that those costs will come down as production scales up and as the technology continues to improve.
It's a bit of a chicken and egg situation, isn't it? We need to scale up production to bring the costs down, but to make scaling up feasible, we need those costs to come down.
Exactly. It's a classic catch-22. But there is some good news. Governments and private companies all around the world are pouring money into research and development, really trying to overcome these hurdles and unlock the potential of green hydrogen.
So it sounds like a combination of technological innovation, government support, and private investment are all going to be key in making green hydrogen a reality.
Absolutely. It's going to require collaboration and innovation across many different sectors to make this work.
Now, let's shift gears for a moment and talk about the potential economic implications here. If there were a widespread shift to hydrogen-powered aviation, what kind of impact could that have on the airline industry, as a whole?
It's a fascinating question, and GKN even hints at this in their paper. They point out that this technology could potentially disrupt not just how airplanes are designed, but also airport infrastructure, maybe even the way airlines do business.
Disrupt in a good way, I hope. Can you give me some specific examples?
Of course. Let's start with airport infrastructure. As we've already discussed, airports would need to invest significantly in brand new fueling systems, new storage facilities, new safety protocols to be able to handle those cryogenic temperatures required for liquid hydrogen. And that kind of investment, well, it could create jobs, it could stimulate economic growth in those sectors.
So it's not just about, manufacturing new planes, it's about rethinking the entire ecosystem that supports air travel as we know it.
Exactly. And then you have to consider the potential ripple effects on other industries. Take, for example, the demand for green hydrogen. If that demand increases because of aviation, well, that could lead to advancements in hydrogen fuel cell technology for other applications as well, things like heavy-duty trucking or even, large ships.
So it could be a catalyst for broader adoption of clean energy technologies in general, which would be fantastic.
Precisely. And then there's the potential impact on how airlines operate their businesses on a day-to-day basis.
How so?
Imagine for a moment that hydrogen-powered aircraft actually do become significantly cheaper to operate than the jet-fueled planes that we rely on today.
Mm.
This could lead to lower ticket prices, which of course could make air travel accessible to a wider range of people.
Now, that would be incredible. But what about the airlines themselves? Wouldn't they be a little bit hesitant to invest in such a radical change, such a different technology?
It's definitely a big ask, there's no doubt about that. But at the same time, airlines are under increasing pressure to reduce their own environmental impact, to become more sustainable.
Especially with, the growing public awareness of climate change and, everyone's responsibility to try to reduce their emissions.
Exactly. And let's not forget, airlines are businesses. At the end of the day, they have to make a profit.
Yeah.
If they see that hydrogen-powered aircraft can actually save them money in the long run, then they'll be much more incentivized to make that switch.
It's just fascinating to think about how this technology could reshape the entire aviation industry, from top to bottom, not just changing how we fly, but also the entire business of flying itself.
It's a classic example of how disruptive innovation can lead to completely unexpected and far-reaching changes in ways we can't even imagine right now.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground here today, both literally and figuratively, but before we wrap things up, I want to circle back to something you mentioned a bit earlier, the idea that hydrogen-powered aircraft, they could disrupt not just how planes are designed, but also airport infrastructure, maybe even those airline business models. Could you elaborate on that a bit more? What are some of the specific ways that this technology could really shake things up?
Of course. Let's start with airport infrastructure.
Okay, airport infrastructure. Let's unpack that a bit. What kind of changes are we really talking about here?
We're talking a complete transformation, really. Think about it.
Yeah.
Airports would need a whole new system for handling cryogenic liquid hydrogen. We're talking new fueling systems, specialized storage tanks that are built to withstand those unbelievably low temperatures, and of course, a whole new set of safety protocols because, let's face it, hydrogen has its own unique set of handling requirements.
Sounds like it would be a pretty big to-do list for these airports to tackle.
It is, no doubt. But let's not forget, airports are already kind of masters of infrastructure and logistics. They've adapted to new technologies before, and they've done it successfully.
That's a good point.
Think back to the shift from those old piston engine planes to jet aircraft. That completely revolutionized the airport landscape.
Yeah, you're right. Airports have a history of, rising to the challenge when it comes to new technologies and new demands.
Exactly. And this is just the next chapter in that story.
Now, what about the airlines themselves? How could this transition to hydrogen potentially disrupt their existing business models?
That's where it gets really, really interesting. If hydrogen-powered aircraft can actually deliver on their promise of much lower operating costs, and granted, that's still a big if, at this point, it could completely change the economics of air travel as we know it.
Okay, now I'm really intrigued. How so?
Well, for starters, just imagine a world where airlines don't have to constantly worry about those volatile jet fuel prices anymore.
Right.
It would be remarkable. You could almost say a breath of fresh air for the industry. It would bring a level of stability and predictability that's practically unheard of in the airline business right now.
I can definitely see how that would be a game changer for them. But wouldn't the initial costs, of actually transitioning to a completely new type of aircraft, wouldn't that kind of eat away at those potential fuel savings, at least in the beginning?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Those upfront costs, those initial investments, it would be substantial, there's no doubt about it. But if those investments can be recouped over time through those lower operating costs, then it starts to make a lot of sense from a business perspective.
It's that classic trade-off, isn't it? A bit of short-term pain for the potential of long-term gain.
Precisely. And let's not forget about the role that governments could play in all of this. They could really give this whole transition a much-needed boost. A lot of countries right now are desperately searching for ways to decarbonize their aviation industries.
Yeah.
Supporting this switch to hydrogen-powered aircraft could be a key part of that strategy.
So there are a lot of factors at play, but it sounds like hydrogen really does have the potential to completely turn the aviation industry upside down. And in a good way, hopefully, changing not just how we fly, but like you said, the entire business of flying.
Absolutely. And it's not just about the economics either. We have to think about how this could actually improve the experience for the most important people in all of this.
Oh.
The passenger.
In what ways? Are we talking about quieter engines, things like that?
Quieter engines, that's definitely a possibility, especially with those new ducted fan designs that GKN is so excited about. But let's think even bigger. Imagine traveling long distances without that nagging feeling of guilt, that environmental impact weighing on your mind. Imagine stepping off a plane, knowing that you chose a more sustainable way to travel.
That is a really appealing thought, I have to say. Sustainable air travel. It's definitely a dream worth striving for. But as you've pointed out throughout this deep dive, the path to actually getting there, to making hydrogen-powered flight a reality, it's not going to be easy. It's going to take an incredible amount of collaboration, innovation from all different sectors. We're talking about the best aerospace engineers, energy producers, policymakers. Everyone needs to be on board and working together to make this happen.
You're absolutely right. This isn't just a technology challenge, it's a societal challenge. It's about fundamentally rethinking our entire approach to air travel and investing in a future where we can explore the world without harming it in the process.
And speaking of investing in the future, that leads us perfectly to our thought-provoking question for you, our listeners, to ponder. GKN has done some really remarkable work here, showing us that hydrogen-powered flight is definitely technically possible. But the real question, the one that remains to be answered, is this. Can we scale up the production and distribution of truly green hydrogen quickly enough to make this dream a reality?
That is indeed the billion-dollar question. And how we, as a global society, decide to answer that question, well, that's going to determine the future of aviation for decades to come.
Well said. Listeners, we hope you've enjoyed this deep dive into the world of hydrogen-powered flight. And as always, we encourage you to keep exploring this fascinating topic. Keep asking those tough questions and think critically about what it all means for our planet and for the future of travel. Until next time, thanks for joining us here on The Deep Dive.